Hi, my name is Karan Varshney, and I'm greatly looking forward to presenting my team's work on COVID-19 and influenza co-infection to you all today. So, getting right into it, as we continue to live on in a world being ravaged by COVID-19, we're also living with the reality that influenza remains with us during these times as well. COVID-19 and influenza are interesting viruses in that they share a number of characteristics, and they also have major contrasts. In terms of similarities, they're both respiratory viruses that are infectious, that they both result in similar clinical manifestations as flu-like symptoms, so fever, headache, shortness of breath, and so on, and they both can be deadly. The final point is a good segue for when we consider the differences between these two viruses. So here we see a breakdown of the mortality rates of influenza and COVID-19 by age in the United States. As is clearly evident, one major difference between these two viruses is the mortality rate, with COVID being markedly higher. It's also worth just pointing out that the depiction here may make it seem like influenza's rate is very low, and it may be, but that translates into roughly 45,000 deaths annually as well. Another major difference between these two viruses is that for influenza, uh, we actually have a number of different drugs to deal specifically with this virus. And while they are soon to be emerging, for COVID, we do not have such treatments at this time. All in all, considering both the similarities and the differences, we wanted to try to answer, well, what happens to a patient if they have both? What if they're infected with COVID-19 and influenza? What are their outcomes? What are their symptoms? And so our work revolved around systematically reviewing the literature to try to find an answer to these questions. After creating search terms, we went through 5 different databases and retrieved nearly 1,800 articles. Our threshold for inclusion was quite low because we wanted to get as much as we could on this emerging topic. As long as the study included at least one patient who was co-infected and clinical characteristics were described, the paper was eligible for our review. And so most of the 26 papers that were included were case reports or case series, though there were a few cohort studies that have been conducted and were hence included as well. Moving on, the slide here shows the results of the data extraction and analysis. A few points to highlight are that of the 544 patients included, more than 85% had influenza A and about 14% had influenza B, which appears to roughly be in alignment with the rates in the populace. Interestingly enough, one patient had both. That aside, it's worth also noting that diabetes and hypertension were the most common comorbidities amongst patients. In regard to symptoms, what we found most commonly are listed here: fever, cough, diarrhea, and so on and so forth. Now, I know that this has already been mentioned, but this is worth highlighting once again, as I've done in this table. COVID patients, influenza patients, and co-infected patients all tend to show very similar symptoms, not the same symptoms. Of course, this what's shown here is not inclusive of all symptoms, but I'm confident that I managed to get the point across. Therefore, the only way we can definitively know if a patient is co-infected is if we actually screen for it. And hence, as per the recommendations of the NIH, who say the exact same thing, we say that it is of absolute necessity that COVID patients who are hospitalized be screened for COVID as well as influenza, as this can clearly guide treatment and most certainly save lives. And another very important finding of this work was the mortality rate, which is 16.9% amongst all of the co-infected patients. This is very high and indicates how deadly co-infection has the potential to be. While there is a need to acknowledge that just about every patient in the study was already hospitalized, and so this is not inclusive of the rest of the population who did not get sick or did not even show symptoms per se, um, and and hence were therefore possibly given the impression of a higher mortality rate. This is still very high. It appears to be much higher than the rates for hospitalized COVID patients, which, according to a systematic review that was published recently, was about 10%, and definitely much higher than those of influenza patients, whose hospitalized mortality rates is in the single digits. And this leaves us with another clear direction for the future and the present. It is crucial that we ensure that amidst the pandemic, that people continue to get the flu vaccination. There's many benefits to this, as we all know, and our review provides another clear and tangible benefit of the flu vaccine: to reduce rates of co-infection, which, again, will almost certainly save lives. Another very important element of this review is what was not found. As already mentioned, the overwhelming majority of patients included were hospitalized, so we have little to tell us about co-infection in the population as a whole. How common is it? What are the general rates of morbidity and mortality? We don't actually have answers to these questions. Furthermore, we don't have answers regarding whether or not one of these infections increases the likelihood of contracting the other. If I get influenza, am I more or less likely to get COVID? And vice versa. And we don't have a great idea of what treatment regimens are best for co-infected patients. While it's likely that influenza ARVs will be useful, there actually hasn't been a lot of study on this. And so these are all avenues for future research. In closing, I'd like to just reiterate the points already made, that it is critical that we ensure that flu vaccination rates stay high during this time, and this will almost certainly help control the rates of co-infection. Furthermore, screening for both of these viruses will be integral for guiding treatment and for, again, ultimately preventing deaths. Thank you to everybody for listening, and please feel free to contact me for any references or questions at all.